everyone. My name is Christy Kirkland, and I work with the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation, a statewide public-private partnership that works to spur innovation across Georgia and beyond. I'm very excited today to be hosting this Smarter Together webinar session with the renowned Strategic Energy Institute here at Georgia Tech on the topic of exploring the role of microgrids in our energy future. Before we get started today, just a few housekeeping notes. The session today will be recorded and will be posted to our website later today if you need to refer back to it. Also, during the webinar, please feel free to post questions or comments for our panelists in the chat function, and we hope to have some time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. If you would, attendees, please keep yourself muted and your video off. So with that, I would like to hand the webinar off to our moderator today, Rich Simmons, the Director of Energy Policy and Information Center.
Thank you very much, Christy, and it's great to have everyone here today for a discussion on microgrids. I'd like to welcome everyone myself on behalf of the Strategic Energy Institute, and also thank the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation for making these webinars possible. Some really fun topics lately. And before we start, I want to advertise another great one coming up in 2 weeks on hydrogen, fact and myth on hydrogen, moderated by Tim Lewin, our director of our Energy Center. So please note that on your calendar too. Let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'll have a few framing remarks, and then we'll get into our agenda. Today we have 3 great speakers participating, all with direct experience interacting with microgrids in various capacities. Abby Roy is the Managing Director of New Ventures with Southern Company. She's been with Southern since 2014, has experience developing strategies for energy storage, distributed generation, and microgrids. She has degrees in chemical engineering and business from the University of Alabama. Our second panelist today is Andrea Pinnabel. She is the president of Southface, an Atlanta-based NGO, a role she's held since joining in 2017. Her career includes more than 25 years of experience in sustainability, community development, and philanthropy. She also has a chemical engineering degree, and that one's from Iowa State University. Dennis McGinn is a retired Vice Admiral from the U.S. Navy. His career includes more than 35 years of active duty in the Navy, including experience in the deployment of energy efficiency, renewables, and microgrids to meet resiliency and operational objectives. He has contributed to the work of a number of boards and holds a degree in naval engineering from the U.S. Naval Academy. So a virtual round of applause for our panelists, and we'll turn it over to them in just a moment. I think I wanted to start with just a few comments about new energy innovations. We're seeing so many. The rate of change is, as we noted, quicker than policy and practitioners in some case can keep up with, particularly those that disrupt the current way of doing business, and certainly microgrids all in that category. I liken this a little bit to battery storage and the deployment of that. I don't know if you want to go back 5 years or 10 years. We identified this as a really useful potential tool for electric power in particular. And we've seen sort of big scale deployments across the country in batteries. We've seen big price declines. But let's say at the beginning, this was something that traditional grid dispatchers couldn't put their hands around. It wasn't load, it wasn't resource generation, it wasn't any one tidy thing. And yet we're seeing lots of great use cases and applications. And I think to some degree, similar things can be said about microgrids. At the same time, maybe later in the panel, we'll talk about, reasonable expectations, because I think in some ways, again, with that battery analogy, it isn't necessarily all things to all use cases. And so we'll think about, some of the trade-offs and maybe some of the economic implications. And then what I thought we would do at the beginning here is just sort of give each panelist a few minutes to talk about what a microgrid is from their perspective. And you've got three great perspectives. You have utility, you have kind of a built environment community, and then you have more of an operational, maybe military and broader grid electrification perspectives from the three. So what we're going to be hearing about is microgrids can provide reliability and resilience because they can island. They can maybe make sustainability more attainable by integrating, distributed resources, in particular renewable ones, and also adding that feature of battery interconnection. There are some economic benefits, but they also come at a cost. So the question is, how do you value some of the things that have not traditionally been valued? And they can be obviously autonomous. So I think that there's a range of sort of behind the meter interests, as well as sort of the grid aspects. But before I turn it over, I think that it bears repeating, their use is really dependent currently on the user, the local context, their location, and sort of how they're going to be dispatched. And again, when we think about batteries and value stacking, it's important that we don't oversubscribe some of their benefits. So with that, let me turn it over first to Abby, and then Andrea and Denny for some perspectives on what a microgrid is.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I guess I'll start by just, describing kind of how we internally at Southern talk about microgrids at the very basic level. We kind of think of them in two buckets. And so one bucket would be what we would call a basic microgrid. And so that microgrid would have one type of generation asset in the microgrid, but it would have the capability to island that customer, to potentially, bring some economic benefit to that customer or to the utility. And so that's kind of the most basic. And that type of microgrid generally has some type of natural gas or reciprocating engine involved. And we see that commonly deployed. They're paralleled with the grid. And so they can still operate in that mode of operation of islanding. And then really where we're starting to transition and see a lot of activity is in what I'm going to call an advanced microgrid. And an advanced microgrid in our terminology is a microgrid that has multiple assets involved. So it could have a reciprocating engine. It could have solar plus storage. It could have a fuel cell in it. So it could have different types of assets. And those assets are all working together on behalf of the customer or the utility or both. And so there's a lot more advanced controls in that microgrid, and it could have different functionality. So that's kind of the two different buckets that we see. The more advanced systems are still extremely new. We're still learning a lot about those and how they interact and what the failure modes are of those types of assets. Whereas the more basic microgrids are something that I think, we at Southern through our subsidiary PowerSecure are very we kind of know how those work. They've been being deployed for, 15 plus years in the current mode of operation. And so we're very comfortable. However, as we kind of transition to our net zero solutions, we're thinking a lot about the deployment of these advanced microgrids and how we kind of transition and make them most economically viable. So I'll kind of stop there. Maybe Andrea, you have a community perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, when Southface's perspective on microgrids are similar to that of Abby's, in that we think there are many different levels of microgrids and the use case for microgrids, specifically within community. I would say that microgrids are an absolute opportunity for some of that distributed energy power. And not only on a building basis, but on a community basis. And we don't see this a lot in Georgia because of current regulations, but we do see a lot of community solar in other parts of the country where you have either ground mount or other types of solar that are then distributed to a community or to a neighborhood or to a school or to other types of use cases. We do have a few in Georgia. HBCUs are currently putting together a microgrid. Southface has also been working on some smaller microgrids within the state. One thing that we think is really important for thinking about microgrids and that use case is that we have a lot of cities. City of Decatur is currently going through this. City of Atlanta in March of 2019 passed the adoption of the Clean Energy Plan, which they wanted to achieve 100% clean energy by 2035. And that we know that you cannot think about energy and energy use and energy creation in a one-size-fits-all mechanism. And so in order to support different kinds of communities, different kinds of use cases, we think that microgrids are a current and definitely a future use for being able to meet the needs of different communities for different kinds of uses. And the other thing I wanted to bring up, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is that microgrids are a phenomenal way of creating resiliency. City of Atlanta also has a resilience plan, but in definition, resilience is the ability for a community to quickly adapt to stresses and to shocks in the system. Stresses are long-term issues that are happening to a community. Shocks are very quick things like storms. We all know that we're having stronger storms more often, and microgrids are an effective way, especially in cases where you have battery storage as backup, being able to utilize some of supporting resilience and supporting quick recovery of community-based issues for warming centers, cooling centers, communication areas. And we can talk a little bit more later about definitions of resilience and communities resilience versus climate resilience. And I think that's a really important definition to talk about, but I'll kind of leave it there. That, you know, Southface, we truly believe that we need to think about all kinds of energy distributed opportunities, and that we think that from a building location as well as from a community perspective, microgrids can be an effective use case.
Excellent. Admiral McGinn.
Hey, thank you, Rich. I agree with the comments by Abby and Andrea. Let me pick up on Andrea's point about resiliency. Mother Nature has not been kind to us over the past few years, and as Andrea said, it's going to get more frequent and more intense. So we all like to keep the lights on all the time, 24/7, 365. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. So microgrids effectively are a distributed energy resource. Done right, and I would tend towards what Abby defines as advanced microgrids, where you have a power source, where you have storage, where you have a grid that is operated by and controlled by sensors, information technology sensors and controls, to the extent that you can actually, in addition to providing generation from various sources, you can control load so that you're able to keep the most critical loads fed with whatever power is available. So you can envision, okay, the grid goes down, microgrids come on, medical centers, first responders, military installations, and information technology hubs. But you can also make the case that there's a tremendous synergy between microgrids, or can be, between microgrids and the regular grid. During times of high load, you can actually help avoid starting up peaker plants at great cost in both real dollar terms as well as in environmental terms, by contributing into the grid to shave off some of those peak loads and keep everybody in that general grid going. So it has a tremendous synergy done right, and that requires and implies a lot of coordination and partnership not just on a technical level, but on a technology and a financial level, with providing utilities and also the microgrid owners and operators, which, oh, by the way, could be the utility. You could think of it almost as we're moving towards a grid of grids. The idea of using less fossil fuel is very, very appealing, but we're going to be in the business of natural gas, perhaps diesel generators, clean diesel, and also increasingly, I think it was mentioned earlier, fuel cells to provide that power source. But it is so much more effective if you think of a microgrid not just as a power generator, but as one that can really help manage the load for the larger grid as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Denny. So the idea is that the microgrid enhances resilience, but it also serves as a power quality stabilizer and demand source, and leverages the components so they're more effective operating together. Let's go back to Abby. Could you share some more experiences and insights on some of the work you're doing at Southern Company Power Secure, some use cases? What are the value propositions that you and your partners are interested in?
Yeah, I can, Rich. I can talk about the partnership that we have with Georgia Tech. First, that is really what I would say. We're piloting an advanced microgrid right there, in Tech Square with Georgia Tech and Georgia Power. Power Secure helped us build that microgrid. That microgrid is it's a resource that we're looking at testing, resiliency on behalf of Georgia Tech. We're also looking at testing multiple interconnection and load sources with Georgia Power and how we could potentially use that resource. And then we're testing some new advanced power electronics in that microgrid. If you look at the components there, we are very fortunate to have this in the state of Georgia, where we have a microgrid that has fuel cells and energy storage and reciprocating engines and advanced microgrid controls. And that one, we put in a natural gas generator and a clean diesel generator, so that we could even look at the differences in the fuel sources and the resiliency availability of those different types of resources. And then we have the ability to add a microturbine in the future. And we have some energy storage on that project that is a 4-hour duration energy storage system that works in conjunction with all of the different loads and the advanced controls. So, if we're looking at the different use cases, I think, one of the interesting things that Admiral McGinn mentioned is also, how does that interconnect with the utility, and how do we work together to maximize the resource? And so this microgrid was designed with some strategic interconnections that we could over time evaluate how it would operate on behalf of the utility and all of the people of Georgia, whether it is, quality issues or capacity issues in the region, without jeopardizing the resiliency component for Georgia Tech. And so it's got many different, perfect, Rich. It's got many different components of value that we're going to be able to see over the next couple of years and quantify that. So as we're thinking on the utility perspective, we want to develop programs, right, that allow our ratepayers and customers to enroll in and receive some of that value. However, we always normally go and do a few research pilots so that we can think really hard about how we quantify that and maximize that. And so here, this is a perfect view, Rich, of looking at there's a market layer that the microgrid looks at, that clearly we're piloting something that we want to be scalable as well. So yes, this is hopefully, going to be very successful in Georgia, but we also want this to be successful across the country, because we think this is a component for everybody to get to net zero. And then I think the controls layer is really important. This is a space that is still developing, in my opinion, because we've installed a few advanced microgrids at this point. I think maybe more than most people around the country, and we have them in different use cases. However, what we learn is the control setup and the operational modes of the microgrid, they're different in different use cases. And so testing those extensively and not jeopardizing your reliability is going to be critical as this grows. And then this chart mentions the cybersecurity layer, which is critically important. As we think about the future and more things getting connected into the internet and more people are in the cyberspace, right? How we handle cybersecurity with more things interconnected to our grid is going to be critically important. So this is another test layer of how we develop and can grow cybersecurity components to enhance the security of the microgrid. And then you have the load control is kind of your basic layers that are on site. Those are your physical layers on site and how those resources interact together to maximize efficiency. And as we think about load control, we also have to think about data, right? Because we know that in the future, as we bring AI components into these microgrids and we start doing more forecasting, we're going to have to store and think about how we utilize that data to further maximize the operation. So we're starting to think about how do we go into the building and not just outside of the building. And we'll be able to do that with some advanced controls and knowledge from what we've done here at Georgia Tech.
Great.
Rich, you add to that.
No, that's excellent. Actually, I think it's a good segue. I am going to show you a picture of the actual microgrid. You wouldn't imagine what goes on behind the wall, but that's why we showed you this series of layers. It's not something that you would stop and pay notice to when you walk by it, especially now, but maybe you'll look at the mural. This is located at 5th and Spring Street. But let's segue now to Andrea and think about how the microgrid of this type of scale might be useful to a community and sort of the built environment user base.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rich. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with the resiliency aspects of it. And as Denny said earlier, I think it's also really important to note that microgrids are a wonderful opportunity to bring in clean energy solutions, solar especially. And to the point that Abby made with regards to cybersecurity, if some terrorists were to come and to look at the grid system, having a distributed energy across not only the state of Georgia but across the United States will allow for resiliency and support the redundancy of the need of the cybersecurity within our overall grid system. So I think with regards to cybersecurity, with regards to redundancy and resiliency, those are really important. But I also really wanted to talk about, to the point around resiliency, just to set the frame of some definition. So community resilience is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover stronger from significant shocks or stresses, maximizing social, economic, and environmental benefits. And we know that in times of natural disaster, our most vulnerable communities get affected most of all, because they're not the ones that are going to have a lot of the a system to a generator, or they're going to. We also know that our vulnerable communities are the communities who are more apt to be flooded. So the resiliency of the community is really important for equity across not only the city of Atlanta, but across our state and across the nation. In addition, on the climate side, and the reason I bring up solar is climate resilience is reducing the causes of human-driven climate change, basically mitigating for that climate change, preparing for and managing the impacts of climate change, which is the adaptation side of climate change, and doing both by applying a social and racial equity lens with attention to procedural, distributional, structural, and transgenerational aspects of equity. So when we really think about climate resilience, we want to make sure that we are utilizing all aspects, including microgrids, as an opportunity to build in that resiliency and that climate mitigation and adaptation aspects. And here we can do that in a lot of different ways. We can do SEPAs, which is solar energy procurement agreements. Southface has got several of those happening right now, where we are acting as we created another company to be able to procure solar for a nonprofit or for another entity, and then we lease that solar back to them, and it's all contained so that a nonprofit school, in this case SAE school in which is in over by Six Flags, is actually 100% solar plus storage, the first 100% solar school in the state. And they have the storage and the solar because schools and community centers and universities are acting more than what they have always been, right? Because in times of climate issues or in times of brown or blackouts or in times of community distress, people are flocking to community centers and schools for solace, for shelter, for communication. And a microgrid is a really amazing way to be able to create those opportunities to have, as I said earlier, a cooling or warming center, a communication center, social services center within a community, especially vulnerable communities that are hit hardest and don't have the safety net of either $400 for an emergency issue or other things that are happening. So we've been seeing several examples of those that are happening and very, very successfully. And I'll put in the chat the SAE school example that was launched last year. And not only is there 100% solar plus storage, but they also are saving about 30% of their utility cost per month, which is allowing for them to put all of those dollars back into the programs of that school. SAE is sustainability, arts, and entrepreneurship. And so these are really important aspects for driving STEAM into these children's lives. So that's one of the things I wanted to look at. Also, with regards to solar and the clean energy part of microgrids, there's a lot of co-benefits associated with that in terms of health aspects and also the ability to get back, as we saw in Texas and we saw in other parts of the country, the ability to be able to get back to normalcy as quickly as possible. So I think there's a really great aspect to that. But no nonprofit or for-profit or government entity can do it alone. And it really takes public-private partnership, whether it's Georgia Tech and Southern Company, or whether it's Southface SAE School and some of the investors of that, or whether it is other corporations that I know they're investing in this space. We are definitely in the early stages, but I've been cautiously optimistic to the opportunities to move the community and the resiliency part of that forward.
That's excellent input and good to give us those social perspectives. I think we'll turn to Denny McGinn now. And another thing Andrea and Abby have implied is, even though we showed you the generic framework and the layers, microgrids do not have to be ultra complicated, right? And I think in a conversation with Denny, we said something as simple as a Ford F-150 connected to your house could qualify. So why don't you give us a little more on that, talk about some of the bus
Sure.
applications and other takes.
I am going to purchase my own microgrid. It's called an F-150 Lightning. Anything that has the wonderful greenhouse gas reduction characteristics of an electric pickup truck, all of the functionality, 400-pound forward compartment called a frunk. And oh, by the way, as you said, can keep the lights on for 2 or 3 days in the event of a grid outage. That's my kind of microgrid. And I think we'll see a lot of people, not just Fords, but GM, Chrysler, across the board. This is, I think, evidence of a trend, a growing trend towards electrification. In this case, we're talking electrification of transportation, but it applies to industrial processes as well. But one of the things with electric transportation is that puts a tremendous storage asset out there. So imagine in a community, all the school buses being electric with big batteries, and oh, by the way, very much a structured charge discharge schedule. They're tremendous assets to help power the grid. The so-called vehicle to grid capacity is going to increase. To Abby's or to Andrea's point about social equity and being able to help communities under stress because of some natural disaster, I'll tell you, I would love to see every big box retail store, Walmart and Target and everybody, with their roofs covered with solar panels and battery capacity. Parking lots are deserts that should be populated with great shade producing solar panels and charging capability. So there's tremendous opportunity. It's a very exciting time as technology moves out, as new policies are developed at the local, state, and federal level, and as new financial mechanisms to pay for these, because microgrids done well actually pay for themselves over time. When the skies are blue and the birds are singing, they can be wonderful assets for grid stabilization and lowering costs and avoiding the need to light off peaker plants. But when the lights go out, wow, functionality keeps going. The dip in functionality due to a power outages isn't as deep, and the recovery time is so much faster. So all of these are possible with microgrids. I wanted to mention, Abby talked about the control layers and what needs to be done there. There's a tremendous amount of work that is going on in the federal government, Department of Energy. Idaho National Lab is one of the leaders in microgrid control mechanisms. So there's a lot of assets out there, and I know in Southern Company, great work done by Power Secure, one of the microgrid producers, and they can do it all. They can do it with the diesel, they can do it with fuel cells, they can do it with solar battery, and so it's just a very exciting time for microgrids out there.
Excellent. So I've got one more question for the panelists briefly, and then we've got some great audience Q&A. So this has sort of two parts. We're talking about resilience. I think this is something we have to grapple with monetizing. So the question is, what are appropriate approaches to understanding the value of resilience? And I think you've all implied there's a net total benefit of the value. But when we look at maybe the hardware and the economic costs on a first order basis, that proposition is not as obvious. So when we think about things that Andrea alluded to in terms of benefits to the community or that rainy day opportunity, as well as things that Denny mentioned relative to, smoothing the grid and enabling more renewables, what are thoughts on appropriately valuing resiliency? And
let me jump in real quickly with a comment, and I really look forward to Abby and Andrea's thoughts on it. But I would use the word aggregation. If you take a typical campus, Georgia Tech, for example, or an industrial complex, you'll find that there are diesel generator sets scattered all over. They're varying ages, varying levels of pollution and noise production. But if you were to aggregate the needs on that distribution grid and have a larger power generation source and load control capability called a microgrid, what a tremendous value. That could be done with community solar projects for critical neighborhoods and areas. And so I think that as we discuss the value of resiliency, being able to achieve it at scale through aggregation really reduces costs. It increases the functionality and the number of stakeholders that benefit from that additional resilience.
I think that's a really important point, Denny, is aggregation. But I think another thing that we think a lot about at Southface is the use of existing buildings too. So what are the infrastructure pieces that we already have that can be retrofitted, not only for the carbon aspects, but also for the community aspects. So we're currently working with Fulton County on the creation of a resiliency hub. And we looked at, well, we've kind of narrowed it down to 3 different locations. The Metropolitan Branch Library, the Louise Watley Library at Southeast, and the Neighborhood Union Health Center. And those locations were based on not only the physical infrastructure of that building, can that building actually house solar plus storage plus potable water systems, but also the location, like the sense of place. What does that location look like in terms of community engagement, educational programming, and what a community, in particular, a vulnerable community, will need in times of shocks and stresses. So I would just not want to just put as an idea into the ethos here that we all don't have to be new systems. Like, let's look at our existing infrastructure. Let's look at the places that make sense for being additive. And then to Denny's point around aggregation, instead of having a diesel generators all over, like, what can we actually do to aggregate some of those opportunities and put them in places where we already have the infrastructure, the social, as well as the community infrastructure to be able to support different parts of those communities in times of need.
Okay, I'm going to jump in after Andrea. So I think, the way I think about the kind of economic value proposition and what I like to tell people that are exploring microgrids is, one, be flexible, because there could be some inference, out in the marketplace that a microgrid is kind of plug and play. And we've installed over 2 gigawatts of microgrids to date. And I can tell you from experience that I haven't seen a plug and play microgrid yet, and that they're all very different, because depending on who's installing the microgrid and what the situation is and where they are in geography and what's important and what is the cost of the outage, is there a utility program in place that they can take advantage of? There's all of these variables. Do they have enough space to install solar so that they can get the benefit of that low cost energy as a component? There's a lot of variables that are going to go into the design of the microgrid. And so, I think that if people would have the flexibility and go down, asking kind of all those questions, that you can determine an economic value proposition of a microgrid. And what I like to think of is, like, then think about how that microgrid grows over time. So what if you cannot afford on day one to put in the amount of batteries that you want? However, you may have an electrification strategy, to Denny's point, that as you get that electrification strategy, your whole value proposition of your microgrid may change and you can add to it. So one of the things that we're thinking about is maybe customers may start with a basic microgrid, and how do we think about that initial design and allowing it to kind of grow over time, so that we're adding more sustainable resources, we're adding more advanced controls, we're allowing more things to interconnect to it over time, as either the technology becomes available or as the funding becomes available. And so to me, flexibility is key. But there are many places in the country today that you can get started. So if I'm a big box retailer, for example, and I have that tier 2 diesel generator outside, as Denny mentioned, like, there's no reason that most people today couldn't go ahead and install some paralleling switchgear and start idling that facility and, receiving some benefit from a utility tariff. Like, that would be so simple for a lot of people to start doing today. And then they can grow that. They can add solar on top of their building as they can make the economic case. They can add storage. So that's kind of like how I like to think about the economic value proposition, Rich.
Great, excellent. All right, so I'm going to
Rich,
we
if
have
I may just
Sure,
add on to
please
what
go ahead.
Abby just
Yep.
said, as I think that's a really important point, what Abby's latest point, in that technology is changing very quickly right now. We're having a lot of innovation, whether it's coming out of one of the national labs. The DOE has been funding a lot of innovation, and we're seeing a lot of innovation coming out of the private sector. And so I think having robust systems, even if you start with your F-150 and then growing it from there, having the ability to adapt and be agile with these systems are going to be really key for not scrapping them and starting again. And again, that's much more sustainable. So thinking about in a way that's scalable, that is growable. And as technology continues to innovate and get better, and efficiencies in battery and storage technology also get better, as well as solar technology gets better. I think that was just a really important point that Abby made that I wanted to underscore.
Excellent. Naturally, the flexibility is a highlight, the ability to aggregate. I guess, taking a counterpoint on that, is it possible in terms of expectations, we would maybe fail in the sense that we expect them to do all things all the time? And what are some of maybe the more difficult trade-offs? For instance, we said these assets can island. That assumes something's wrong and there's a group or a particular user base of interest that we feel like deserves that more attention. Obviously, when it's critical infrastructure, that's clear. But let's say it's not as black and white as that. What are some of maybe the more challenging aspects of that flexibility and that islanding capacity?
I'll jump in because I have a few thoughts. So I think, it's back to it depends on a lot of things, Rich. So if I, wanted to install a solar plus storage microgrid, I have a limited amount of generation via my solar, right? But think about like if I'm in the fall season, the level of resiliency when my load's kind of low on my building because, season, it's not that hot. I don't have so much going on. The level of resiliency that a 100% renewable microgrid could provide to you could be really, really good in the fall season. Whereas if you're in, peak winter or peak summer, depending on where you are in the country, and your load profile of your building is going to change, right, over time. And so the level of resiliency that you may have for being 100% renewable could be less in a different season. Whereas if you had solar plus storage and you had some type of reciprocating generation, it's going to cost you a little more to install that. However, you have a firmer level of resiliency over time. So, depending on what your goals are and how much you're willing to kind of give and have flexibility around your cost, your sustainability, and your resilience, you could go different ways.
Yeah. To Abby's point, one size doesn't fit all. Right. We really, really need to understand what is the location, what are the resources in terms of energy sources, what is the purpose of the microgrid? Is it something that you're going to be islanding very, very frequently, or is it something that only occasionally? A quick islanding story in the summer of 2020, out in California, tremendous record-breaking heat wave really pushed the utility providers to the limit, and the transmission and distribution grids to the limit. There was a request from the California Energy Commission to the United States Navy to see if they could use their microgrids called Navy ships. So when a ship comes into port in San Diego, for example, it shifts from on shipboard power to shore power to just give the crew a rest to be able to do maintenance and all of that kind of stuff. But in this 2020 heat wave in California, just to keep the lights on and really ease some of the load of the Navy ship, every Navy ship that was able to shifted off of shore power and went on to entirely ship power, i.e. think of a ship as a microgrid, and it really, really helped. So that's just one example of where fairly significant microgrids can be very, very useful to island in the face of a storm like Texas experienced last winter, or California wildfires, no matter, or even in hurricane situations. There's a lot of opportunities, but understanding, why do I want to have a microgrid and what do I want it to do under what conditions?
You know, in my previous life, I was head of sustainability for Starwood Hotels globally, and we used that sort of, ironically, it was an island issue, but in the Caribbean, this happens a lot. And in some of, we think about even our Georgia islands, but we had a resort in St. John, and our general manager used to get a text message saying, we're taking you off the grid in 30 minutes. And we still had guests and residents and staff, and it was really important, I think, as we think about our island nations, the Puerto Rico in particular, who just kind of was off the grid for many, many years, about the benefits of islanding for a microgrid, but also the vulnerability of that as well. So you need to be able to switch it. It needs to be quick. And in the case of St. John at the time, which is a very spindly grid, and so if they would just take them off all the time, and so we had to create a microgrid system that would allow for operations to continue in a seamless manner and be able to sort of switch back and forth as needed. But that was just on the resort. So if you think about the island as a whole, where you have residents and you have other businesses and you have hospitals and you have libraries and community centers and schools and all of the other things that have to continue to operate, that's where you have sort of the pros and cons of a microgrid system, where you can support whatever operations need to happen, but you also need to be able to make a seamless transition, so you're not blowing out pumps and all of that. At the same time, when you have, to your point earlier, Rich, in terms of vulnerabilities, there is redundancy in grids, right? Because you can go back and forth, but it also makes those smaller grids more vulnerable to attacks if it's a particular, a location that may have value to somebody, or they may just be subject to cyber attack or ransomware attack.
Great. All right, so let's move to a few of the audience questions. We'll probably have time for a few of these. The first one I'm going to paraphrase is from Pratiksha, and she wants to know about the scale and the constraints of the space, given that you're integrating these with existing infrastructure. So maybe some thoughts from the panel on what are the typical sizes and how are they typically integrated? And are there constraints on what you can do? For instance, the reference to small modular maybe, or what other types of generation could be accessed?
I can start. I think the amount of space is really one of the first things you're going to look at, is what do you have access to be able to use. The other thing that's important to look at immediately is like your building codes, your local building codes in the area, and even like the age of your building, because sometimes just because you have a roof, your building structure may not be suitable to put solar on that roof. So I think there's an initial kind of engineering analysis and audit that would go on in any microgrid to determine like what is the available amount of space that you could use. And then you can start thinking about like, how do we get creative in getting what we need in that space. But I will say there's also ways to get creative. And so we have, we've designed systems from 200 kilowatts to 65 megawatts now, I think is the largest one that we have out there. And so it varies, and we can go up in space. So we've stacked batteries before versus lining them all up in a single layer. We have the ability, if we wanted to stack fuel cells, we could do that. So, depending upon what the space constraints are, we can think about how much we can get into that space. On the reciprocating engine side, another thing that we are thinking about and how we're setting up our building blocks is just having different configurations, because sometimes you're trying to stuff a microgrid in a corner and then sometimes you have a big long space. And so you're looking for different types of resources that also may have different configurations that you can put into different spaces. So I know our team at PowerSecure thinks a lot about having different types of layouts for different components. But it really just kind of depends on what you're working with, and you'll see, you kind of see it all across the board.
Great. Other thoughts on the space and safety constraints?
I think it's dependent, once again, on what you want your microgrid to do, what assets you have available, including space, structure, et cetera. I think to Andrea's point earlier, wherever you can use adequate existing infrastructure, that really makes a lot of sense, saves a lot of money. One thing I wanted to mention briefly is this idea of expeditionary microgrids. Obviously, the military does that, has been doing it for years, primarily focused on, in the past, on diesel generator sets. Coupled with battery storage, you can operate the diesel generators at their optimum efficiency and max load to charge the batteries, then shut them down. You save a lot of fuel. And oh, by the way, it makes things a lot more quieter and reduces the heat signature for a forward operating base. I wanted to mention also that the Navy Expeditionary Warfare Center out at Port Hueneme in California is developing a new approach to portable microgrids that obviously for military use, but probably will have some excellent value for use by organizations like FEMA in the wake of a large grid outage caused by natural disaster. Great.
I'm going to ask a question by Gil. I'm going to paraphrase. This is about the time to deploy and scale up. The question is effectively, how long does it take to sort of commission one? And in particular, if you were going to deploy something within a city, a large number of these, how would you do it? How long would it take? And how would you address the equity concerns?
I'll take the first stab. I hate to keep saying it depends, but it depends. I think that I could say for reference points, if it's something very basic, like a single asset, generator behind a big box retailer, something like that could be deployed as quick as, 3 to 4 months. Design, constraint, construction. If your equipment's in stock that you need, clearly we'll caveat a little bit because of COVID supply chain issues, but in a normal operating environment, you can deploy something like that relatively quickly. Whereas I contrast that with something incredibly advanced where you have 6 or 7 different types of assets and, 1,000 operating scenarios and load shedding schemes for buildings. And we've had something really complicated like that took us 12 months just to commission because of the testing and commissioning process that had to go through to make sure that we didn't jeopardize the resiliency of that asset. And that one took maybe about 2 years to design and construct. So I've seen them from 4 months to 3 years.
I'll jump in from there. From an equity standpoint, for the city of Atlanta, for examples, we have really good data on what energy burdens are across the city. So energy burden, by definition, is the amount of gross income that a family spends on their energy on a monthly basis. So national averages are anywhere from 1.5% to 2%. We have zip codes within the city of Atlanta that are upwards of 20%. And so we know which of those neighborhoods are more burdened by energy equity issues than others. And that is a variety, it's a mix of a variety of different issues that get these communities to that higher energy burden status. And so those would be the neighborhoods that would be targeted first and foremost. Going back to the Fulton County Resiliency Hub example, that's the reason that we chose those 3 locations, is because they're in very high energy burden neighborhoods. And that grant that we're working with Fulton County and the city of Atlanta was through the Southern Sustainability Directors Network, and making sure that equity was really at the center of that work. Now, when you do things with community, it takes a long time. That project has been going on a little over a year, and partially because of COVID, partially because of a lot of different things, it's been delayed about 9 months. So now we're looking at implementing in 2022 when it was supposed to be implemented this last summer. So, but having that engagement aspects are really important to working with community, not at community, but working with community and getting that solid stakeholder engagement is really important.
Great. We have 3 minutes. We're going to end on time. So I'd like to give each panelist 1 minute to comment on public-private partnerships that might be useful, and how agencies and organizations like ourselves from these various perspectives are all needed as we assess the opportunity for microgrids. We'll start with, how about Denny?
I think public-private partnerships are absolutely key. I think at the federal level, we've got a federal partner that is working very hard to understand what the best financial mechanisms are, what policies need to be changed to avoid what I would call the speed bumps and roadblocks to getting things done, like the wider deployment of appropriate microgrids. I want to end my comments on an equity note, though. I love baseball. All teams are great, but just I think it'd be more equitable outcome if the Atlanta Braves went all the way. They haven't been there in a long time. Thanks. It's been a great conversation.
I think you'd be in good company with this audience. Great. Let's go next to Abby.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Admiral McGinn's comments. I think public-private partnerships are key. They're key to us policy development. They're key to financing mechanisms, to developing important financing mechanisms to get some of this on the ground, and to advancing technology. We have a historical relationship with EPRI and Oak Ridge and DOE, and we've done really amazing things over the years. And I think that we only need to continue doing that, because that will help us unlock the technologies and drive the cost down and keep our energy affordable for all of our customers.
Excellent. And Andrea, you have the last word.
That never happens, by the way. Yeah, I agree with everything Denny and Abby said, and thanks so much for bringing this really important aspect to light today. I would say that we have a lot of work to do. That as you started the session, Rich, is that we're still getting more information on storage, and microgrids are the same. So I think the public-private partnerships, and I would even go with the 4 Ps, public-private, and philanthropy also needs to be in there in the 4 Ps to really ensure that the equity aspects also get addressed, and that the research that is coming out of like the smart neighborhoods that Southern Company are doing, and some of the work that Oak Ridge and some of the work that Southface is doing, and some of the work that EPRI and the Strategic Energy Institute are doing, that those actually get disseminated through the organization so that they can be applied to all aspects of our communities, and that there's M&V. This is where the chemical engineering part of me is coming out, that there's measurement and verification and data-driven solutions and data-driven innovation that's coming out of the research that's happening, so we can get scalable solutions quickly. It's really important with all the climate issues that are happening today.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent note to end on. Let's have a warm virtual round of applause for the panel. Let me remind everyone the recording is available. If you didn't catch it all or you want to share it, there's a link in the chat, and hope you can join us on November 11th. Thanks a lot.